Thank you, and thank you all for coming. I hope you can hear this okay. Just because we have a very multicolored and interesting, diverse audience, I'd just like to ask quickly, what's the first thing you think of when you think of Pakistan? Anybody? Any remote? What's the first association you have when you think of a country like Pakistan in the world? Corruption? Okay. Crowded. Pardon? Kashmir. Great food and music, fantastic. So part of the reason we tried to do this talk in this way is because we had all sorts of ideas about what people might think or might imagine Pakistan to be like, and I'm the least qualified person in the room to say it, so Mustafa's here to make sure you get a proper impression of Pakistan. But we hope that we'll be able to give you a slightly different perspective on what you would imagine or what you would think Pakistan could be like as a country, and then to explore a little bit the different dimensions of that, specifically in relation to Republica. So should we go to the first slide?
I think that sounds good. I just want to point out I'm just one person representing an entire country. So a lot of the opinions are just mine and not of everybody in my country. I put this picture up because there's a lot of stories going on in this picture. It's a picture of my family taken in December of 2008 at my sister's graduation. So I wanted to speak a little bit about my family and how I was raised. And so I was raised in a religious household where my dad has a beard, my mom covers her head. But then at the same time, I grew up to be non-religious and they were fine with that. My sister doesn't cover her head, but my brother decided, hey, he wanted to grow a beard right from the get-go. And so very different backgrounds. My sister had flown in for this graduation while she was doing her master's from the London School of Economics. And my mom was funding her entire graduate studies because she wasn't allowed to go abroad alone when she was young. And so she wanted my sister to be able to do that. And so just so much that you can find out from one picture for one family in Pakistan. Every family in Pakistan has all of these stories where there's differences within a family, there are differences between people within a country, and so there's a whole bunch of stuff going on, and it's not just that everybody's very religious or everybody's very outgoing or everybody's very non-religious for that matter. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in Pakistan, and I thought that this picture would talk more towards that.
And specifically, just to imagine a little bit the context, the first time I was in Pakistan was last autumn, and the scary thing for me is when I came back, I got back to my hotel room, and the first thing I did when I turned on TV, there was an episode of Homeland showing. I don't know if anybody's seen this slightly crazy and confusing series. And Pakistan was either the place where the Taliban were running around with big guns, or where drone strikes were being prepared by the CIA, but there was not a single Pakistani person whose was being translated in the language they spoke. So they either spoke English, then the audience could hear what they were saying, or they were speaking this garbled something that a Western audience typically wouldn't be able to understand in this weird language, and they were shooting and killing people and blowing things up. And so you have this weird sort of perspective of, I've just come from this place, and I come back and I see my own representation of the sort of what a TV series wants to show me this country is like and what it's supposed to be and how it's supposed to function. And you're sort of confronted by this, like, my own culture, my own places around me, the American TV series, admittedly, but still are trying to show me things that are just like completely don't fit to this picture. And so I struggle every time when I see Pakistan represented in the news, when I see, it's not just Pakistan, it's many countries in the world, and I'm sure you'll know many more of them. But the extent to which you sort of, it hits you in the face is so weird when you've just come back on a admittedly very long and tiring flight, but then still have this image in front of you that is so starkly different from the picture, and just doesn't even begin to reflect the diversity, the creativity, but also many of the challenges which we would easily take for granted. And I think we have dengue fever next, which is quite a nice example of that.
Yeah, so Pakistan had its first major, really big outbreak of dengue back in 2011, where about 20,000 people were affected in the city of Lahore and Punjab, and about 375 people lost their lives. And in the middle of the outbreak, we realized that we didn't really have a really good disease surveillance system in Pakistan. It was paper-based and it wasn't agile, and we weren't able to find out beforehand if an epidemic was about to spread. And so what this picture shows is a dashboard that the Punjab IT board made, where we're tracking a whole bunch of dengue larvae, Aedes aegypti larva, the mosquito that carries dengue, the dengue virus. And then there's a whole bunch of houses of confirmed patients, and we're trying to find out where hotspots are being formed, such that we can then direct crews towards areas where they need to actually perform eradication activities like flea sprays, etc. And so from 2011 to 2012 and 2013, the onset of dengue has gone down a lot, and the number of people who've died have gone down from 375 to literally 2 or 3 people every year for the last 3 years. And so I thought this dashboard shows a lot about how a country which struggled and was caught unprepared out of the blue, as in dengue had been in Pakistan from 2007, but it never made a big epidemic. And in 2011, we had this onset and nobody really knew what to do about it, and the government was caught unaware. But now there's this whole ecosystem. There's about 1.9 million data points within this dashboard alone, and there's a prediction algorithm that defines where the epidemic is going to spread next. And we measure the accuracy of that algorithm with our dashboard over here right now.
So how are you collecting the data from that? Because if I understand correctly, you run a lab that sort of is involved in projects like this, where you're sort of trying to basically better map and better understand diseases. And just, I think, also for the global context a little bit, this is quite unusual and quite advanced tech, where many parts of Europe, many parts of North America wouldn't have this advanced models for basically being able to predict how diseases spread. Is that correct?
Yes. So there's a paper that my university is writing right now that we've submitted for Nature. And the idea is that we're using cell phones or smartphones as our weapon of choice in Punjab. And we've given smartphones to a whole bunch of entomologists who go out there in the field and try to identify Aedes aegypti larvae. And they're doing it under the naked eye, and they're trying to differentiate between Aedes and Anopheles, which is another form of mosquito that's very common in Pakistan. But now one of my master's students in my lab is actually working on image recognition and trying to figure out if through machine vision you're able to identify Aedes aegypti larva versus Anopheles through a smartphone. So we're trying to attach a lens to a smartphone and then take a picture and then identify in the field out there in real time if it was an actual confirmed case of Aedes or not, so that before we point it to the dashboard, we're very sure we're not having to rely on the naked eye of the entomologist out in the field.
And I think the nice thing as well is that you can see very well from this picture, we've also got another one which is sort of looking at mapping at this quite well, which is the floods. And there again, I think you can see really interesting examples, like when there were big floods in Germany in the last few years, and there was extreme difficulty in being able to predict how the floods would go, where they would spread, what the consequences would be, just because there aren't very good models for this. And so I think that maybe they should call up your lab sometime and ask them to explain how these floods are working. No, because there's this idea that innovation is only produced in certain parts of the world, and that then they have to teach the rest of the world how things are done. And I think this is a nice example where we actually have really good maps and modeling here that allows us to do things the other way around. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. Again, Pakistan faces a whole bunch of challenges that have been recent. And so in 2010, we had a major flood where 20 million people were displaced and 8 million people were left homeless. And so and we could see the floods coming, so they lasted for 3 weeks. And it's a bad feeling when you're helpless, and you can see that the entire country is going to be inundated in the next coming few days, and there's not much you can do except for maybe like going out in trucks and grabbing people and evacuating and those kinds of things. What was really fascinating about those floods was only about 1,600 people lost their lives while 20 million were displaced, and no major disease outbreak took place like cholera or any waterborne diseases when there was a lot of water out in the ground. But then what we've now realized is that due to climate change, Pakistan will face these floods year after year after year. And so in terms of resilience, you look at Bangladesh and how they've fought back really well and they deal with floods every summer. And so me and a couple of other friends of mine, this particular image is from a dashboard that the Punjab IT board made, and this is an inundation map with satellite imagery. But now what we're trying to do is, there's a professor at the university where I work, he and his students are looking at satellite imagery to identify households that are in and around these streams that are highlighted on this map. and then trying to figure out if we can determine the amount of water flow in all of these streams and when the embankment's going to break and how large the spread of the water is going to be, so that we can do SMS-based evacuation beforehand to the households where we think the water is going to actually carry. And so tower-based SMS flooding. So if you're connected to a cell tower, which is in an area that we think is going to get flooded, we're going to send you an SMS. And then post-disaster as well, I have a friend of mine who's a professor at the Institute of Space Technology in Islamabad, and he's looking at ways where you can actually do a comparison of once the floods have taken place, what areas actually did get affected, and A, to improve our algorithm, but B, to figure out when we do cash disbursements for people who got affected by the floods, to be able to do that more accurately. And so floods are coming in a couple of months, and it's just three of us guys who are really trying to figure this out, and we're bootstrapping. But there's a lot of computer science that we're throwing at social problems that we face in Pakistan right now.
And so what does the SMS say? You will definitely get wet feet soon? Or what? How does the...
So we're going to have to work on the exact content of the SMS, but the idea is that by X hours, your house is going to get flooded, and we suggest that you evacuate immediately, or this is the nearest evacuation point from your house, and this is how you can get there, or this is the hotline where you can call and get some help and figure out real-time information around the flood situation around your neighborhood.
Cool. I think we also have some different examples, because we don't want to just go through dengue and floods with you. There's all sorts of other issues that could be discussed as well.
So outside of research that's happening, there's a whole bunch of entrepreneurial activities happening in Pakistan as well, and a lot of Pakistani startups are now starting to make it really big. And the innovation ecosystem in and around Lahore is starting to take off really nicely. And so this picture demonstrates an app that came out back in 2012 or 2013 and made it really big. It was called GroupPic, and the idea was when you're taking a picture of a few friends of yours, you really want to be in that picture. And so what the app does is it stitches two pictures together, so whoever the cameraman is takes the picture and then goes back into with the rest of the friends, and one person from the picture comes out and takes the next picture, and this app perfectly stitches it together such that you don't find out that the cameraman was actually not in the picture alone. And so they raised a whole ton of funding, and there's a lot of other startups. A friend of mine actually raised $300 million of external funding. We haven't had our first major exit as yet in the startup ecosystem, but there's a lot of incubators that the government has started, but then there are a lot of incubators and accelerators that the private sector has started, and there's a lot of startups coming out. There's a German Rocket Internet, it's an accelerator that also has offices in Pakistan, and they recently acquired a local startup called eToy, which basically does food deliveries and merged it with Food Panda, which is their own. So there's acquisitions, mergers, external investment. We haven't seen our first real exit, but we're looking at a lot of innovation in Lahore from the young entrepreneurs and the tech enthusiasts in the city itself.
Sounds like there's a lot happening at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. People don't realize, and they have this image of Pakistan where there's a whole bunch of bombs, like you mentioned, like Homeland, and I've watched all 4 seasons of Homeland. It's really amazing, and I loved season 4 because it's funny because you can understand, like they're using Google Translate to translate into Urdu, and it's like the funniest translation ever. It's a serious program, and then you're laughing about it, and there's this BuzzFeed video that somebody from Pakistan made last week that went viral about what Pakistanis think of Homeland. But then when investors come in and they look at this innovation ecosystem, they're like, oh, wow, there's a lot happening here. So hopefully in the next few years, we're going to have our exits, and we're going to make $1 billion startup that came out of Pakistan.
So hopefully apps and not just drones.
Yes.
But then we don't want to pretend that this is an entirely unpolitical talk, so we wanted to give you a few other examples as well. Can you go through those a little bit just in detail?
Sure. So before we talk about the politics, I just wanted to quickly highlight some of the innovative stuff that the government itself is doing. And so, like, governments are large bureaucracies that are not known for innovation. And this is an example of the citizen feedback monitoring program, or the citizen feedback model. And the idea is that governments are there to talk to their citizenry, and they don't do that really well. And secondly, they don't monitor their own work really well. So if you go to a restaurant and you order food, they'll ask you how the ambience was, what did you like about the food itself. governments don't really do that when you go and get a driving license made, right? As in, they don't try to ask the citizens what they thought. They may be doing some performance evaluation internally, but there's no external input coming into those evaluations. And so a few years back, there was this district commission officer who asked his employees in the administration to collect cell phone numbers of people coming in to acquire government services. So if you went to get a driving license made, or if you went to file an FIR, or if you called the emergency services, they would request and voluntarily request your cell phone number. And what this person would do is the next day you would just randomly call people and say, hey, you came in yesterday to talk to the government. How was your experience? How much did you pay for a driving license? And let's say if you paid $1,200 and the gentleman, the DCO, knew it cost 900 rupees to make a license, he knew that there was some corruption going on, even if you didn't really realize that was the case. And so now what the Punjab IT board has done is they've really scaled this model up. They, instead of having a real person call, they've recorded messages in the chief minister's voice, and they made over 7 million phone calls. And the robocall goes out and says, this is the chief minister of Punjab talking. You came in for this service. We're going to send you an SMS right after this. Can you please respond? And then there's over 1 million responses that we've gotten, or roughly around 1 million responses, and we categorize them into gratitude and corruption and all of those things. And a lot of the times governments are actually scared of getting feedback because their ineptitude would come out. But you'd be surprised how many of the times people are actually saying, oh, everything worked just fine. Or it took a lot longer than expected, but thank you so much for asking. And so we see that in feedback mechanisms around the world where the governments have opened themselves up to questioning and to feedback from the citizens. There's a lot of gratitude that comes in as well. So this was just one example, and there's a case study, there's a link to that, Calling the Public to Empower the State, that was published in Princeton a couple of months ago about this program.
So, but then to put it another way, in parts of the world, for example, I know in the UK, they have Fix My Street, and they're sort of looking at different ways of fixing streets, but here it's more about fixing the whole government.
So there's See-Click-Fix in New York, and the idea behind these kinds of things is there's a crowdsourcing mechanism where citizens tend to report that there's a pothole or there's a manhole missing or a street light's gone off. This is very different though, because this is not coming from hackers. This is coming from within the government and asking about services such as the police and actual feedback about what they're doing. And so this is slightly more different, and then it's been rolled out to all 17 different departments within the government. So yes, we are trying to fix the entire goddamn government.
It's a big task, but it sounds like a pretty cool project.
Yeah.
So moving on just to one other area that we wanted to look at briefly before we go into questions. Will be specifically one of the challenges that we've also seen is that in response to some of the attacks and the sort of problems related to terrorism and to sort of attacks on different places that exist in many parts of Pakistan, but also things like visits from dignitaries, what has happened is that there's been disconnections of mobile phone networks. And so it's quite common for large parts of the internet, for mobile phone networks, to be cut off in certain situations. Is that a correct representation? Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I agree. As in, I don't want to just say everything is really cool out in Pakistan. We're facing a war on our Western Front, right? As in, there's an active war going on. There's been over 1,000 suicide attacks. Over 30,000 civilians have lost their lives. And so the government is responding to that in the sense that one of the ways, and I don't necessarily agree with it, is the kill switch, where they take all cellular networks down if it's a public holiday or if there's some rallies out in the street. But the idea, as in from their perspective, they're saying that they're trying to protect 10,000 citizens out on the street, and an IED bomb may go off with a cell phone. I don't know if turning off the entire country's cellular services is the best way to stop an IED device going off in a procession or something like that. But there is a whole bunch of censorship or information disconnection that happens, and I don't want to say that it's trivial or it doesn't affect citizens, but at the same time there is a very real threat that we face and this country is left alone to protect itself, and so this is one of the mechanisms that the government is using right now.
Right. And I think one of the reasons we became interested in working in and on Pakistan as well as a research center is that we saw that these disconnections were happening quite frequently, and there wasn't anywhere around the world very good documentation on understanding the consequences of what these disconnections are. And so to better understand, not to say that like this is never the right mechanism or this is always the right mechanism, but rather to say these are the consequences of these mechanisms. And together with Mustafa and with other researchers, we're trying to better understand what sort of the social impacts are in the same way as you're trying to map dengue fever and trying to develop other things. I think there's a lot lot of sort of innovation potential that you can see when you respond to this, because you develop very quickly both better models and better maps of doing things, but also more advanced, better understanding of the data that you have, because I think this is a challenge that we're not just facing in Pakistan, but you can see in many parts of the world where there's disconnection of mobile phone networks. And even in Europe and North America, there have been discussion about, shall we turn off the internet here? Shall we disconnect communications there? These are the places where, for example, in Islamabad, you can see that happening right now, see what the consequences are for citizens, and based on that then do research to better understand what's going on. We're going to jump to one more, two slides, and then we'll open up for a few questions. I think we'll just, 1 second. Shall we just jump straight to this one? Because I think it's the most interesting one, just to be able to explain. One of the other things is that sort of historically, when you sort of saying there have been all of these attacks and there's been things going on, you say there's a war going on in Pakistan. Has that always been the case? Has that been the case like in the last 50 years, 60 years?
Not necessarily. In my young life in itself, as in before 9/11, for example, there was not a single suicide attack, or maybe one crazy guy before 9/11, but now we've had over 1,000 suicide attacks in the country itself. And a lot of the times when the country associates itself with the war going on in Afghanistan, whether it be the Soviets attacking Afghanistan or now the US in the war on terror, there's a lot of backlash in Pakistan. So if you look at the 90s, I could go to the grocery store on my bicycle and come back in 10 minutes. And when these suicide attacks started to happen, and it's become a lot better, and the government's responding a lot better. But then I had to go through 2 security checks where my trunk would be open and my boot would be open and those kinds of things, and it would take me 25 minutes just to go get bread. And so growing up, it was a very different country, and now it's become a very different country because, like I said, there's an active war. But what I wanted to show with this picture was there's a whole bunch of really cool stuff that Pakistanis were doing in the past, and there's a whole bunch of really cool stuff that young Pakistanis are planning to do in the future to contribute towards the world, and this slide really shows that. The first picture is of Begum Shaista Ikramullah, who was a monumental part of figuring out the UN's Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And here's a woman that's representing Pakistan in the UN Assembly and talking about women's rights and countering Saudi Arabia and those kinds of things, and figuring out what the Declaration of Human Rights needed to be right after a war where millions of people were killed. And the second picture is of Mehboob ul-Haq, who would work for the World Bank, headed the UNDP, and convinced Amartya Sen that there needed to be a Human Development Index, and was the founder of the Human Development Report while he was heading the UNDP in 1990. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that the Pakistanis have contributed in terms of intellectually towards the world. And if I could literally just show the next picture really quickly. This is a cafe in Lahore, and we were having a dribble meetup, and I don't know how many people know dribble over here, but it's a show and tell for designers. And if I had not labeled this picture in itself, you wouldn't find out that this coffee shop was in Berlin or in Pakistan, for example. And there's a lot of young developers who get together off and on and discuss what the world of UI or UX needs to look like and how Pakistanis can contribute towards that. And like I said, with the startup culture, in Pakistan's ranked number 3 on Elance, which is a freelancer website after the US and India. So there's a whole bunch of tech innovation that will come out of the country in the next few years as well.
So are there any questions? Since nobody, is there a hand? Can I see a hand? Since there's nobody raising their hand immediately, just another point, just to put it into the real context of what we're talking about. So I work at this weird Center for Internet and Human Rights. And just to emphasize again that when you're thinking about the first strongest document that we have in the world, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, everybody in the world knows that Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the sort of main people involved in writing it, and she's very well known. But most people haven't heard of Shaista Ikramullah, who was a young Pakistani diplomat who was also one of the drafters of this document. And so when there's sort of these debates about human rights pushed onto the world, and it's this weird Western concept which we've then forced other people, we forget that there were lots of other countries involved in drafting these principles, including people from all over the world, and this young lady from Pakistan, for example. There's a hand over here, please. Do you have a mic?
In which way is internet censorship, like the blocking of YouTube, a problem for startups?
So censorship is starting to become a big issue in Pakistan, where YouTube has been banned because of the blasphemy and the content hosted and the accusation of blasphemous content on user-generated content website, and it's been banned for about 2.5 years now. There's a whole... it's impacted startups in positive and negative ways. There's a whole bunch of video streaming websites that have come out of Pakistan in response because we're no longer able to access YouTube. But then on the other side, there's a whole lot of content that we're not able to see, or we have to use proxy servers to access. YouTube is just the beginning, as in it's becoming a lot more scarier with the government now planning or announced banning WordPress and some other content sharing websites as well. And so censorship does happen to be a real issue in Pakistan, and there's a lot of civil society who's trying to fight back. There's a lot of organizations that represent the society that are trying to fight back to this really draconian cyber legislation that's in the National Assembly right now.
Any other questions in the audience? There's another hand over here, please. Could you put the mic on, please? Missing a mic?
Yes. I wanted to ask you because I have a friend who is from India, and I know that basically India and Pakistan share a lot of similar problems. He is working in open source and he is working in a startup community. But what is strange to me, he believes that censorship is really important and it's really needed by people in India, in Pakistan, and in the area, because some people aren't just able to access, they aren't able to process everything on the internet, and he believes that there may be a lot of unrest if people would be able to do so. So is there any kind of discussion in Pakistan on this? Because I believe that there are a lot of freedom fighters, but are there also people who believe that some kind of censorship is important, and what are they proposing if they are? What do they believe in? What means of censorship are important?
That's a very, very good question. There's a whole bunch of people who are against blasphemy and would come out on the streets if a video in LA is made around Muhammad, and they'll be protesting on the streets of Lahore or Islamabad. So there's definitely people who may or may not believe in the freedom of expression, or who believe in censorship of such content. And I'm not going to say that a majority of Pakistan believes otherwise. A majority of Pakistan actually believes that blasphemous content needs to be taken down. That being said, at the same time, you need to realize that till about 20 years ago or 15 years ago, Pakistan just had, and like most other developing countries, just one state-owned media or television network. And so all of this content and overflow of information that you get with the World Wide Web is really, really new, relatively very new. And to absorb all of this new information coming from all different directions, it's going to take time for the society to mature. And I'm very hopeful and very sure that it will mature very soon.
And just to jump in there as well, we skipped over one slide specifically, which was looking a little bit more at sort of the polarization of the society, also in response to sort of lots of acts of terror, but also just sort of an ongoing societal debate about sort of what the appropriate role of religion in society. And I think the challenge there is that not so much that the censorship is always in every situation the appropriate tool, but that the consequences of it are not well understood. And so it seems like a very easy, a very straightforward solution, which is it just gets rid of the problem, when sort of the polarization itself within society is a huge issue. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. Pakistan now sees a lot more polar responses to a lot of the stuff that happens, where if you look at this, there's Pakistani atheists and agnostics, and this is a Pakistani newspaper clipping, and on the other side you have lawyers celebrating the guy who killed the governor who was trying to fight against the blasphemy laws in Pakistan. And so there's a lot more polarization, but on both sides, whereas maybe 20, 30 years ago it was mainstream conservative Islam. And so there's a lot of conversation happening in society, which I think is good, and it's scary that it's so polarized, but hopefully it'll come back with conversation in society.
Any last question, or? Then I think we're good. All yours.
Thank you so much.